Welcome to Leading with Curiosity. Command and control leadership is dead. We interview leaders, entrepreneurs, and executive coaches challenging old paradigms and fostering cutting-edge leadership. Here's your host, certified executive coach, Nate Leslie.
Cliff, you've grown up in your organization from a teenager, literally 17 years old, to where you are now. What have you learned most about leadership in that journey?
Yeah, thanks, Nate. You may think you know it all at 17, and certainly I was probably of the generation that did think they knew it all. You know, I just was happy to have a job. I was happy to go and respond, and natural hazards and responding in an emergency really became about the hazard. And in my case, that hazard was about wildfire. It was just about the state of the ecosystem or what that fire was doing. As I've evolved and now spent, the better part of 24 years fully immersed in the world of wildfire in British Columbia through some of the most devastating fire seasons, not just this province, but the world has ever seen. The biggest learning for me is it's not about the hazard. It's about people. Whether it's the people that we're trying to evacuate and keep safe from the community perspective, or whether it be our own people within wildfire who we've seen over the last number of years struggling with mental health, with PTSD, with the impacts of not necessarily fire, but that fire interaction with humankind, that fire's interaction with people's livelihoods. And that having not just an impact on people who may lose a home or a business or part of their property, but also having an impact on the responders who are there trying to save them or trying to save that piece of property. And so, for me, the biggest learning has just been that, kind of like a lot of industries, it really is about the people.
You go from 17-year-old, you work your way up through the organization, you get to crew leader, where your biggest passion was fitness, right? And being in the best shape possible. If you had a do-over, what would you be focused on as a young crew leader?
Yeah, for me, the biggest learning is that when you're a leader, you have people who are in your care, and that means so much more than their physical attributes. And so understanding the culture of BC Wildfire Service when I first became a crew leader 20 odd years ago really was driven by hard work and all the things you hear about with military organizations and first responder or policing organizations. This really sort of passion, drive, suck it up mentality. So to me, all that, what I learned from that culture as a crew member before I became a leader was that I need for my crew to be the best, and therefore for me to be the best leader for my crew. It was all about that strength and that commitment and that hard work and that grittiness. And don't get me wrong, all of those things are important, but they are not nearly as important as making sure that those who are in your care are looked after. Those who are in your care have emotional support, mental support. They know that they can have balance in the workplace. They know that they can come to you, not just because they're struggling with work, but they might be struggling in another way in life. None of that mattered to me when I first became a leader because I didn't know it had to. Growing up in a high-level sports environment when I was younger, it was all about winning. But winning looks a lot different when the game you're playing is about people's lives and their livelihoods, and you're shaping them to be better versions of themselves. And frankly, that goes so far beyond physical fitness and being the most in shape crew. And if I could go back in time, I would have spent a lot more time looking after the whole human as a leader, not just trying to be a fit crew.
Yeah. You know what? We haven't said the word performance. You did mention winning, but early days, it was about performance, right? That the physical aspect of it. And I'm connecting now what we know about high performance culture. It's performance and a positive human experience. And your people have ups and downs in terms of that human experience because of what they see and witness and the burden they carry and what they're responsible for. But it's that human experience element. How are you supporting it? And how are you prioritizing it that has become your real focus, hasn't it, now as the director of operations at BC Wildfire Service?
Yeah, it really has become my focus. And, Nate, I've shared with you in the past that I never knew what was driving me to take different jobs within the organization necessarily. I think when I first started the first 5 to 10 years of my career, I was chasing that adrenaline of fire and helicopters and airplanes and being out in the middle of the wilderness, frankly, that was probably untouched or touched very little by humankind. Because when I first started, most of our fires weren't adjacent to communities. And so there was this drive of just the coolness of it, if I could be so frank. And what started to shift, though, was eventually that shininess fades. And what I wasn't clear on as I started to become more of like a middle leader and then more of a senior leader is like, what am I chasing? Because I wasn't satisfied in the jobs that I had, but I couldn't really pinpoint why. I couldn't pinpoint what I was looking for. And there were times through my career where I wondered if I could find it in fire. But what became clear to me in the last number of years, in particular, as we've started to make a real keen shift in making our culture more inclusive and really trying to make it a place where we want everyone to belong from all walks of life. What I realized is that, while fire might have kept me in the business, it really is that human contact. It really is that human potential. It's why I'm still here. It's to make the changes that can be impactful, not just for this generation, but for the next generation that come after us. Because frankly, the fire environment's getting worse. So we need to make the workplace environment as good as we can, because the challenges that we face currently and that the next generation is going to face, they're going to be much harder than what I faced when I started in this organization, because the environment's changed.
So you've got you evolving and growing from teenager to responsible man. You have the natural world changing, and you have the culture inside your organization also evolving, and you've been through all of that. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, Nate, it's kind of like anything. I think it sometimes requires personal impact for us to truly see, that things need to shift. And I'll go early in my career first, and then I'll fast forward a little bit more recently. But, I'll never forget that the day that my mom told me that she was diagnosed with breast cancer and was going to need a double mastectomy and wasn't sure what the results were going to be when she went under for surgery. And I remember in that moment having to go to my manager's office and being really, really scared because I didn't know what I was asking for yet. This was very fresh news. I grew up with, not the whole time, but for a chunk of my life, just with my mom and my brother. And so we had this family dynamic. It was really personal but yet I'd never really seen her in pain. I'd never really seen my mom go through anything before because she was so strong trying to raise two boys and do it all on her own. Anyway, so I knew I had to go talk to my manager, but I didn't even know what I was going to talk to him about other than to tell him this and that I needed something. What was the something? I didn't know, but I was really scared because there had been nothing before me that showed that it was okay to have this conversation. Wow. And what it was going to look like. So I walked into his office and I think I got 2 words out before I started crying. And this manager, who was way ahead of his time for the culture, just embraced me and just held space for me. And I spent an hour in his office and we talked about what this could look like and what it needed to, like what my needs were. And he asked hard questions, but they were only hard because of the emotional journey that I was on. Like, do you need to go home, Cliff? And home obviously wasn't where I was working. I was in Williams Lake and home was in Vernon. And I said, I don't know. And so we talked through that. And so, over the course of an hour, I felt the most supported I'd ever felt in anything in my life. And it just hit me in that moment. And as I reflect on being a crew leader for the first time and thinking fitness is what mattered, in that moment, I knew what mattered. In that moment, I was shown what matters is holding space and being there for the whole human experience, which is very difficult as a leader to be there that way. And so you learn from that. And it was like, okay, well, that sort of shaped my trajectory to say, well, I want to make that change. I want everybody to feel what I just felt. I want everybody in the organization to know that it's okay. It's okay to cry. It's okay to have emotions attached to your mom or your family or whoever that may be. It's okay to ask for help and not know what that help is. And it was okay for the manager who I was talking to not have all the answers either, because he didn't. But we worked through them and we got to a place where I felt supported as an employee. And I just wanted that for everybody. And so when it comes back to looking at my career through what was I after, it kind of struck me in that moment, but I reflect on it more now that was the catalyst moment for me, one of the catalyst moments for me to say, this can be a better place to work. This can have a stronger culture that is about the total human experience and our leaders To be effective in that space, though, things were going to have to change, both from a training standpoint, from an experience standpoint, from an onboarding and hiring standpoint. And so it was not going to be a fast journey, but it was a journey that, I knew I wanted to get behind. And, as I fast forward now, about 15 years later, I can sit here and say I'm very proud of what BC Wildfire Service has put forward in terms of trying to shift the culture to be more inclusive, more about the total human, as well as change some of our curriculum and our training design to try to be more open to things like resiliency, personal resiliency, as well as workplace resiliency, mental health, addiction support, counseling and therapy support beyond just the standard benefit package, but actually looking for other opportunities for our people who really felt like they wanted a first responder connection to any therapy or counseling that they were going to go and seek. And so we put that in place with an ex-wildland firefighter who became a clinical counselor. And we worked with that company to stand up a safe reporting line that every employee in BC Wildfire Service has access to anytime they want, as well as our families. So it's a small step, but it was a big step to start to shift that we were going to make change to the culture of BC Wildfire Service so that it could be a really wonderful experience for everyone. While we're not all the way there yet, I can sit here and say I'm proud of where we have attempted to go and learned and adjusted and now continue down that path of supporting every employee who works for us.
I just want to juxtapose where you've come from, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you and I have talked a lot about this. You and I both come from high performance sport background. Me beginning in the mid 90s, you maybe a little bit later than that, but essentially when junior hockey in Canada, when that locker room wasn't always healthy, right? And you have drawn parallels to that environment in your organization when you were young. And I know there's still work to be done in both sport and your organization, but for the listener, like, we're juxtaposing a world where you never talked about this stuff to where you're here on this call talking about what's most important to you as a leader and the director of operations in an organization like this. That's a long way in a couple of decades. Let me put this in the form of a question. What are you most proud of that I know you're a humble guy and you'll deflect it to all the others who deserve the credit. What's an initiative you're most proud of that maybe wouldn't have been there if it wasn't for Cliff Chapman?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing that Cliff Chapman has done in isolation.
Okay, that Cliff Chapman has done with his team and the many teams.
Yeah.
You've mentioned the counseling, just which I know you've spoken of before and really proud of. Is there anything else that's standing out to you?
That one jumps to mind, but I'll use actually the initiation of this, Nate, because I think it tells a different story, which is, when we talk about high performance sport, we talk about junior hockey, and you and I have talked lots about this and the parallels to first responder and just workplace culture across probably lots of industries. Maybe one of the differences is there was definitely some of that maybe overt behavior, the harassment, the bullying, the hazing of new recruits. Like, there was that, which I would call was the overt. And those were, I think as an organization that was trying to be addressed through the HR process and sort of the collective agreement process. So we'll just leave that as a side. When I became my first step into being a leader of a geographic area. So when I stepped in to be the deputy fire center manager of Kamloops Fire Center, which has roughly 400 staff, and I was now one of two senior leaders for that entire structure. I got a letter sent to me from a staff member, and it was like a 7-page letter that outlined what she felt was undertone culture and undertone references to what it took to be a firefighter and how her experience was really, really hard. So hard that she needed to seek outside support. And nothing contained in that letter was could have led to discipline. It was undertone language. It was the way courses were designed. It was and it was such a well-written experience for this individual. But I think when I read it, all I could think about was like, you're not alone. This has been many, probably hundreds of people's experience, including mine. Growing up and coming into an organization as an 18-year-old hockey or 17-year-old junior hockey player, and everybody knowing that when you step in. So they've already made some assumptions about it. And then me seeing the culture, knowing that it was performance driven, that it was like, again, be the fittest crew, be the hardest working crew. So that's how I showed up. But that's not who I am as an individual. That's not who I was at 17. I quit playing junior hockey because I hated the dressing room. I hated the way that it operated. And hate is a word I don't use very often, but that's why I quit playing hockey. I wasn't never going to make the NHL, but I still loved the game. I quit because of the culture. And then I came to Wildfire, and similarly, I couldn't show up as Cliff, not full Cliff.
They've made assumptions about you because of your past experience, which is actually the stuff that caused you to leave in the first place. That's right. An interesting juxtaposition, right?
Yeah. And so it felt like, and of course, growing, you enter into a workplace and you've been taught by your parents or by you just show up and you work hard and you put your head down and that's how you'll get noticed. And then you'll make like all the things we learned, or at least we learned generationally when we were younger. But all of that, I would say, not that I think it's wrong, but it's not enough. It's not the whole story.
You know what? I'm seeing it now because those are great qualities, right? Let's not dismiss that those are great qualities. I'm seeing them now as pillars.
That's right.
Like the work I've done with your team on what are your 5 objectives. That put your head down and work hard is a pillar, but it used to be the whole thing.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. So now you've got these other pillars, and that's where you're headed now, the pillars that you've helped create in addition to being fit, in addition to working hard, in addition to being resilient and, really getting down and to the important work. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that. Go ahead.
No, and I think that's a great, I used to describe it when we first started this work. And I think that's, long story short, I think the thing that I was describing that I'm proud of is that I went to essentially the equivalent of our CEO in Wildfire. And I had this really poorly made PowerPoint with what I saw were the problems with the culture of Wildfire. And it was based on this letter, and it was based on, I had done some interviews with staff in the center that I was running or that I was leading. And so I had some data, but it was loose. Yeah. And I put together this awful PowerPoint. I actually pulled it up not that long ago, and I was so embarrassed that I was so proud of it at the time. And then you fast forward, 8 years later, and I was like, I built this is awful. Anyways, what I'm proud of is that I both felt that I had to, but I also felt just safe enough to bring this PowerPoint to my boss, who represented all the managers, that represented all the staff. So this was a very important step. And I shared what I called at the time people practices for BC Wildfire Service. And I had done up some crappy clip art graphics and some things, but it was real and it was human. And it landed. And Ian asked me to present it to all 30 managers, which I then did because I knew I had his support. And that's the power of leadership as well. If he had asked me to do that sight unseen, I would have been very, very nervous and reluctant to do it. But he'd already seen it, and he knew that he was going to offer some level of support. So I had him not doing that ahead of time. I still had to come in and present and make sure the other managers saw it as well. But, I think the moment of clarity for me that was like, I'm in the right place at the right time was when I presented to those 30 managers. It was nodding heads and appreciation. And it was a lot, what I would describe as the best way to describe is the looks on people's faces as it's about time. Like, we need this. And then we were just off. So while I can't take credit for any one particular thing, it was that. And I thank to this day, and will always thank, and I'm still connected with the individual who wrote the letter, that she essentially turned Wildfire's culture in that moment. And I'm just proud that we were actually able to take something and say, this is bigger than it appears, and it's across the organization. And it might actually make us admit to some things that we don't want. They're uncomfortable for us to admit organizationally, but if we don't admit them, we will never move. Things like the fact that we had this culture of just be the hardest working, and that's all that matters. Right. And everything else could be pushed to the side. All other poor behavior could be ignored. So we kind of had to admit that organizationally to make these changes with people practices.
And now that fitness is a pillar, right?
Absolutely.
And God, there's so many threads we could chase here, but I want to just share a couple that have come to me. That one right there, we know that culture is defined by the worst behaviors that the leaders tolerate. So even if the fitness is great, but if that's your only priority, then all that other stuff got, as you say, pushed to the side. Another obligation of a leader is to remove barriers for others. And you took that choice to lead as that young guy. When that woman presented you with that letter, you chose to take that upon yourself and share it with Ian. And then he too removed barriers by opening the door and say, okay, here's 30 managers, right? Because that could have stopped right there, or he could have took it himself and made it his own initiative. But he opened that door and said, Cliff, it's your time to rise here. You're making this choice. What do you make of that idea that part of our role as leaders is to remove barriers for others?
Yeah, I think about that in the context of response organizations but I think it's all organizations. I think it's this idea that I do firmly believe change can happen at all levels, right? Yeah. Like I think any level of an organization.
That's a great example of that, right?
Can push change.
Yeah.
I think that push becomes uphill and the boulder becomes much bigger if the leaders along that path are not helping and they're not removing those barriers. And sometimes removing the barriers is just vulnerability. It just takes the director of operations going on an all staff call and saying, I too have lost my spark in my career where I wasn't sure whether I wanted to show up to work the next day. I too have felt the burdens of the pressure our organization faces and have struggled with my own mental health challenges and have got help for those challenges over the years. I too have gone through divorce and have had to then navigate what work looks like as you're dealing with the emotional trauma of that with kids and ex-partners and new partners. And so, while we used to keep all those things locked in because they're ours and that's our personal life and how, don't you dare bring your personal life. The reality is we all bring it, maybe not all of it, but you don't get the choice to just turn off feelings. Just like you don't get to convince somebody their feelings are right or wrong. They're theirs. They're their feelings. And yet for generations, we've asked people to just show up, walk through the door and turn that side of themselves off. That itself is going to lead to a mental health epidemic if we don't start to address it and say, we recognize that you might have things happening at home. Happy if you want to talk to me about it. I'm here for you. Otherwise, just let me know so that I know you're going through something. You don't have to give me the details, but at least I then know as your leader and your peer that you're going through something, because most humans are. I mean, if there's one thing I've learned through the last, say, 10 years of my career is that there aren't many humans I've met once I get in a relationship with them where they don't have some form of trauma that they've had to process over the course of their career.
There's been so many moments in this conversation where I'm contrasting different realities. In other words, as you're describing how it can be, I'm thinking about the ways that it's not. And we've talked about the evolution and the journey that you've been on. As you're talking about things like divorce, and that can be a place, if you want to talk about it, that it's safe enough, as you said earlier, to talk about it. I've worked with a client recently when I mentioned, what do you know about your team? And he said, oh, well, I don't want to know stuff like that. He put his hands up like this. I don't want to know stuff like that. We gather data a lot as we're working with clients using the high performance index, other tools that I've talked a lot about in other episodes. Guess what the psychological safety of his team looks like for this person who doesn't want to know. I don't want to know anything. It's terrible. And is there performance? And it results in things like he doesn't care. He doesn't know what we're doing. I can't be myself. Right. So are there boundaries? Yes. Are there guardrails? Is there a certain limit? Yeah, probably. And the point is, when you were a kid growing up in the organization, it was a lot harder to have that conversation. Cliff, we should mention, and as a humble guy, I know we'll change the subject very quickly, but it was only last year that you were given the Premier's Award for Leadership in the province of British Columbia, presented to you by Premier Eby at the time, voted on by a number of professionals outside in other industries. A number of candidates were nominated. And as a young guy, you did win that. And I know you made a lot of people really close to you very proud, including me. We've been working together for, I think over 5 years now in a coaching relationship, which we said we'd talk about a little bit here. Introduced first by Ian Chisholm and the Right Group, which we're indebted to them for connecting us. We want to talk a little bit about the role that coaching and leadership development has played in your journey in those last 5 years. Do you mind if we shift to that?
Yeah, no, for sure.
So when you think about, the journey in the last 5 years since you've had regular access to coaching, what has shifted for you in that time?
I think I'd start with saying the relationship matters. So as Nate mentioned, him and I have this coaching relationship, but I was very particular about what I was looking for. And I think that stems from this idea that we're not supposed to ask for help especially when you get into a more senior role. But I have to say, like, thank goodness I did, because you don't know what you don't know until you have a safe relationship with an executive coach who you can work through problems and challenges with. And while we're not getting into it today, Nate knows them all. Like he knows more about me than a lot of people do, because of the relationship that we formed, and we don't always agree. And I think that's the beauty of the relationship first, and then that being with your experience and education and your skill set. It just works because we might come at things from different lenses. There's usually things we agree on, and then you help me get to where to come up with my own solution, right? You're not solving my problems for me. You're telling me the solutions are in there, and or they're with your team, and or they're with your peer group. Your job is to pull the best out of me, and you do time and time again. And it has shaped how I show up as a leader, and it has shaped how I show up even as the director of operations when it comes to things like when I'm asked to present to the provincial media. I often have Nate in the back of my mind about how do I best get this information to the public? How do I best represent the organization? When you speak about the Premier's Award, the thing that makes me most proud, and it's probably the only thing I'll say about receiving it, because it was the most rewarding and yet what I would say undeserved recognition I've ever received. And that's just how I felt about it. But what I will say is that receiving that award wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for in my opinion, for our relationship and for what you've taught me about how to translate what I think. And I just think in ways that I have at times described to Nate as abstract, but they're not that abstract. They're just sort of human focused or people focused. And Nate helps me bring that in to the operational and the tactical, and how do you connect the dots with business planning and work planning and strategic planning, while also all the things I've talked about so far today about looking after the whole human, integrating mental health and resilience into the workplace, not asking people to turn their personal lives off when they show up at the front doors of the office, like all of those things. So it is this like real sort of holistic relationship that is really difficult to have within the workplace, because your boss is your boss. And your team, they report to you at the end of the day. Even though you might have a wonderful relationship, there's still a hierarchy to it. Just like there's a hierarchy to my boss is my boss. And so having a third party coach has been massive, to have the ability to share openly successes, frustrations, failures, and then work towards the next step with Nate, who is my coach.
I'll deflect that similar praise and call it the coaching process. But you mentioned that fit is important, right? Fit, that relationship that you and I tested the waters, and you decided that this felt right to you, and me likewise. And you're an external processor. A lot of your ideas get really clear as we're talking. What has it meant for you just to have that block in your calendar that it's not about us, it's about you, right? I'm just there to help it be even more focused. But have that time in the calendar that you've got space for Cliff and his either fully formed ideas or yet to be formed ideas. What's that been like, compared to not having it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I think it ebbs and flows a little bit, Nate. And what I mean by that is that I think early days, what I looked forward to was the safety. Like I looked forward to, it's not like in any organizational structure, in any hierarchy, it's like we need the ability to be 100% transparent about what might be frustrating us or challenging us in the workplace. And again, like I just described, it's hard to do that sometimes within the hierarchy. But when I looked at the calendar block, it was like I felt this safety of like,
wow,
I get this hour with my coach, and there's never been an hour where I didn't feel better on the back end than I did on the front end, right? Every hour has gone, it's almost, it just goes that way, where I might come in, I'm feeling really agitated or I'm feeling really frustrated. By the time I come out, it's always like, and my next steps are this, and this, and I feel good and I'm ready to go on my lunchtime run or whatever. So that is sometimes the experience. Most of the time, that is the experience. I think the other thing with the hold in the calendar is it is professional development. And so for me, the ability to be able to speak about, regardless of level that you achieve, whether you're a crew leader, a fire center manager, or a director, or an exec director, which is above me, you still need to have time for yourself. You still have to commit time to to your own development. And that's what I look at when I have my hour with my coach Nate, is that that's also professional development for me, that I share openly with my team as well as others who want to listen, that I am also seeking coaching support for my professional life, because it doesn't matter how long I've been in wildfire, I still make mistakes. I'm not anywhere near perfect. And this relationship helps me at least make more informed decisions about the direction of travel that I choose within the workplace.
You make so many mistakes. It's just sometimes scary.
I do remember how many times I've come to Nate saying, Nate, this will be like, it's going to come from way out in left field, and I just need some help trying to tether it to reality. Because, sometimes I describe to Nate as like, sometimes it feels like I'm on an island with this idea that I've been thinking about, and I don't know how to articulate it fully. And by the end, I always have the ability to articulate it in a way that, while it may not land with everybody who it needs to land with, at least I will be more clear in what I'm trying to articulate and not feel like I'm on an island by myself, but be able to have a more holistic conversation.
Well, that's a good point. Maybe it doesn't all land with everybody, but when does it ever, right? And
Exactly.
And you getting more clear on what's most important to you, and the growth that I've seen in you over those years is that, just that conviction in what's right. So you go from idea to conviction through this process, right? There's a moment, I've had the privilege of working with your directors team a few times, and your managers, and you and I built this relationship virtually, right? From pandemic to now. And I think we've only been in person together about 3 times, but one of those first times we greeted each other with a big hug. And your team that loves to chirp you was like, oh, I see. Okay. And it was a moment for me, though, as they're chirping, seeing this relationship that we've built. It was, it was just a really proud moment to be like, oh, yeah. Of course, that's how we would greet each other. We spent a lot of our life together, albeit virtually, over the last many years. And that's been a real honor. I've had a chance to work with your team and beyond. What impact has that had to have that facilitator, and that we've done some team development work just for you and your peers?
I think about this often, especially early days in my career. So much of all the levels of leadership within wildfire, they all generally speaking, promoted from within. And so there was this like carry forward of, call it expertise, but I call it lived experience. And sometimes lived experience creates bias, which is it's like what I would call is informed bias, because it's your experience, and it's kind of like feelings. You don't get to decide what someone else's feelings are. But my point in all of this is to say that sometimes I think it's required, when you're talking about challenging topics that there might be some conflict within them, or at least potential conflict, to have a neutral third-party facilitator that is trying to draw the most out of all the participants. Not just hear one person's story, not the loudest voice in the room, not the thinker who just speaks as they're thinking, which is me. Of course, I practice trying not to be the one who does that all the time, but not just the loudest voice in the room. That facilitator, they're not there to be subject matter experts. They're there to get the most out of the room. And that's what that experience has taught me, in particular working with you, and is to be able to, topic aside, put bias to the side, but still people need to share their lived experiences. They need to be heard. Like if a room hasn't been heard until everyone's voice has been heard. And if you don't bring in outside support for those types of conversations, sometimes you just won't get that, because the loudest voice in the room will prevail. And often, and I won't say this for BC Wildfire Service anymore, but I did see it in the past, it was the same voice every time. And now, what needs to shift with that is that there are such diverse perspectives out there. And you only get that if you listen, and you only get that if there's something to listen to, which is what I believe a trained facilitator, their job is to pull that up.
Oftentimes when you observe a meeting, and whoever leading a meeting or a team can absolutely do much of this on their own, but sometimes a meeting starts where someone just starts talking. Whereas a coach facilitated meeting says, okay, we're going to talk about X for the next hour. What do we need to have in an hour that makes it really worth it? And it just narrows the focus and the focused outcome, right?
I think the other thing I would add, Nate, is that it's not just about the work. I'll go back to one of the things I said to kick off this podcast. Relationships are the foundation of everything. And so Nate coming to work with the team of 6 directors at BC Wildfire Service, realizing quickly that some of us had never met each other also in person and or had just met even virtually. Well, we're about to dive into the priorities for the entire organization, but we don't know each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, so that's where that facilitator and the skills I think that you bring, and I think others will too, is like there's also a relation, like a forming stage, right? There's a build a relationship, connect,
Yeah.
be a bit vulnerable. That's a sliding scale, right? Vulnerability doesn't mean everybody's breaking down and crying. It could mean that, but it doesn't have to mean that.
Yeah.
It might just mean that we're sharing a little frustration about priorities. Like it could be very specific to the work. So I think sometimes we've misrepresented like what vulnerability needs to look like. That's going to be unique to each individual, but a good facilitator will pull that out of each individual to where they're comfortable.
Yeah, and that's where I prefer to call that work that I do team development. There's something about the word team building that people think you're going to make human pyramids or do trust falls or whatever, but and a lot of the physical, I know I would love a lot of it, more the physical team development. It's just hasn't been my area of practice, but more facilitated, facile, which means to make easy, exercises to deepen understanding about yourselves, first of all. Who's Cliff? And what does Cliff bring? And what does Cliff need to watch out for that he brings? And then getting to know each other as individuals. And it can happen over dinner, like this much, right? 10%, or in those facilitated experiences, tenfold in terms of what you can learn in an hour. And I think before I got into this work, let's say back in those hockey days, of course, through sport and adversity and wins and losses and through your fires and stuff, the way the team and the crews probably come together can't be dismissed. That's extremely important. And not every day in the workplace is a catastrophic fire. And there's so much that we can do. And you end up getting feedback, things like, I never imagined that leadership development would be so personal. I've had that on more than one occasion. And then we talk about this whole person, this whole human approach to leadership. And we're like, well, what else is there?
Yeah.
What else is there between how I show up and who I am and what it feels like to be in a room with me as a leader? And in fact, if we're talking hierarchy, the higher we go, something like the leadership circle assessment, focuses on creative versus reactive tendencies. And for the people watching on video, I'm going above the line on creative and reactive below. A CEO or an executive director or a director of BC Wildfire Service, it's equally as, I don't want to say powerful, impactful, how you show up with people than the content that you know. You can lift people up or push them down with your body language, with something you say, right? And I'm not saying that, there are challenges with this era of every word we use being potentially used against us. I'm not talking about that in this episode, but I'm talking about when your team shares a vision to 2,000 people or to the entire province of British Columbia, those words and that vision, where you're headed, really, really matter. So understanding who you are as a person and who you are as a team that leads this organization is, imagine trying to do it without that. Well, you have tried to do it without that, right? In the early days of your organization. Yeah. Cliff, for the people listening in Western Canada who appreciate so much the work that your organization does to keep us safe, I think about you all every day that I'm at my cabin on the Sunshine Coast or anywhere near a tree these days. Although in our next episode, we might have to talk about how my wife didn't really like how fire smarted I made our yard, but she'll be happy in the end. She was a little surprised there are a few limbs missing, but I know you got my back on that one.
Yeah.
But, to the people listening around the world, and they do every month, 15 to 20 countries, your human-centered approach to leadership has always inspired me. And I've learned I always look forward to that calendar block because I know I'm going to learn something along the way. And as a guy who's seen a lot for a young man, you're an inspiration to a whole generation of leaders here. And I just hope you keep being you and doing what you're doing. Thanks for joining us on Leading with Curiosity.
Well, thank you very much, Nate. I appreciate those kind words. And maybe I'll just end with a really quick story, if you don't mind.
Yeah, do it.
My daughter the other day, who at times she's 11, struggles with anxiety. she called me into her room to have a talk, and I could tell she welled up, and she said, "Dad, I don't know how to tell you this, and I don't want you to be mad, but at school last week, I told my friends that when you and me went and got period products, because she is expecting that at some point in the next 1 to 4 years."
Yeah.
And she wanted to be ready. And so we went to London Drugs and we got the things. And of course, Dad had to Google what I needed to do in that situation. And so what she was admitting to me in that night, though, in her room with tears in her eyes, is that she told her friends about it and that she was embarrassed. And she felt bad that she told her friends that she was embarrassed, because she said to me, "Dad, that's not true. I really appreciated that you wanted to be involved, and I love you, and I love that you wanted." So we talked it through, but I wanted some time to process. So all I said was, "I'm not mad. I get it. Being that young is difficult." But I went back downstairs and I reflected. And what I reflected on is that two things can be true at once.
Yeah.
She can be proud that her dad was willing to go to London Drugs and buy those products with her. At the same time, she can be embarrassed when she's talking to her friends about that situation. Not because she was embarrassed in the moment. She's embarrassed because she's now talking to her friends about it. And so the next night I went to my daughter and I explained this to her. And of course, she didn't make it, like, at first was really struggling to make sense of what Dad was saying, but then it kind of clicked. And it kind of clicked for me too. It was like two things can be true at once.
Yes.
I'm relating it to work now to say, I think sometimes we like to work in absolutes because as humans, we crave control. We crave control of our feelings, of our thoughts, and of and how we execute them. But we don't have control over all those things all the time. And I think if we can get to a place where we can say two things are true at once, like somebody had an experience and they're viewing it as positive, that's true to them. I might be viewing it as there were mistakes made within that. That could also be true.
Yeah.
And they can both be true. And if we can get to a place where they are both true and we both are okay with it being true, then we can actually learn. Then we can actually grow. Then we can get out of a defensive positioning and move to a how are we going to move forward positioning, which is a much better collaborative positioning than you're wrong, I'm right, or you're right, I'm wrong. We can both be right.
Two things can be true at once, and we can feel two things at once. Cliff, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Nate.
Thanks for listening to Leading with Curiosity. Please share, follow, and rate the show so that other leaders can make positive change in the world. Connect with Nate at nateleslie.ca. And remember, the brain behaves very differently when encouraged to think rather than told to listen.